Have you ever felt a weight you couldn't name? A shadow that clings to your steps, heavy yet unseen? It's not the loud crush of a life-altering moment, not the chaos of a visible storm. This is subtler, a quiet erosion of the spirit, a tension that hums beneath the surface of daily life. The mother who forces a smile as she juggles endless tasks. The student who stares blankly at a screen to avoid their thoughts. The man who buries his fatigue in silence. They all know this weight. Dr. Gabor Maté would call it the body's cry, a signal of disconnection from the true self, forged in the crucible of suppressed emotions and societal demands. This is the silent struggle, the invisible burden that carves its mark not in dramatic flourishes but in the slow, relentless drip of stress that pulls in the heart. The world does not teach us to pause and feel this weight. It teaches us to perform. Society's unspoken rules: be productive, be pleasing, be perfect, wrap around the psyche like vines, tightening with every step. Maté's wisdom reveals that stress is not merely a reaction to external pressures, but a conversation between the body and the soul. The body, he reminds us, is a mirror of the mind's unvoiced truths. When the heart races for no apparent reason, when the shoulder's not under an invisible load, it is the body speaking what the mind cannot. The woman who lies awake, replaying a moment of judgment from a colleague, feels this. The man who swallows his anger to keep the peace carries it. These are not fleeting moments, but echoes of a deeper wound, often rooted in childhood, where the need for approval first took hold. Stoic philosophy, through the lens of Marcus Aurelius, urges us to focus only on what lies within our control. Yet, how does one control the weight of a world that measures worth in likes, achievements, or appearances? The silent struggles are born here, in the gap between who one is and who one feels forced to be. Maté's work illuminates how early experiences, perhaps a parent's unspoken disappointment or a culture's rigid expectations, embed themselves in the nervous system. The child who learned to shrink their voice to avoid conflict becomes the adult who carries stress in clenched fists and shallow breaths. The body becomes a vault, storing every unexpressed fear, every moment of self-betrayal, until the weight feels like part of the self. Consider the young professional, polished and poised, who feels a pang of inadequacy at every meeting. Society praises her ambition, but does not see the nights she spends questioning her worth, or the father who provides tirelessly, yet feels a hollowness he cannot name, as if his sacrifices are never enough. These are the silent struggles, the ones that hide behind smiles and "I'm fine." Maté teaches that suppressing these truths does not erase them. It buries them in the body, where they manifest as tension, fatigue, or a quiet ache that lingers. You, watching this, might feel it to that moment when a casual remark lands like a stone, or when the pressure to keep going feels like a betrayal of your own heart. That is the body whispering, begging to be heard. What if the stress you carry isn't yours alone? Maté's lens reveals how societal structures endless productivity, gendered expectations, the myth of self-reliance shape the very air we breathe. The Stoics, like Epictetus, would argue that external judgments are not ours to carry, yet they seep into the soul anyway. The woman who feels she must always be nurturing. The man who must never show weakness. They are not just individuals but archetypes, shaped by a culture that rewards conformity over authenticity. These pressures are invisible but palpable. Like a current pulling beneath the surface, the silent struggles are collective, a shared human experience of navigating a world that rarely pauses to ask, what do you truly feel? This is the start of seeing those struggles, of naming the weight that has no name. The journey is not about banishing stress, but about listening to it, understanding its roots, and reclaiming the self from the grip of unseen forces. The body speaks, and the heart yearns to answer. The silent struggles, once acknowledged, begin to loosen their hold. inviting a path toward healing that is as quiet as it is profound. The silent struggles weave themselves into the fabric of daily life, invisible yet ever present, like a pulse beneath the skin. The body, as Dr. Gabor Maté teaches, is not a machine to be ignored, but a living archive, storing every moment of unvoiced pain, every compromise made to fit the mold of a demanding world. The woman who rushes through her day, her mind a tangle of deadlines and doubts, feels this archive in her tightened chest, her shallow breaths. The man who buries his frustration to maintain an image of strength carries it in his rigid shoulders, his restless sleep. These are not mere symptoms but signals. The body's desperate attempt to speak what the mind has been taught to silence. Stress, in Mate's view, is not just a response to external chaos, but a reflection of an inner disconnection, a fracture between the self and its truth. Society does not reward this truth. It praises the performer, the one who pushes through, who smiles despite the weight. The archetype of the good person, selfless, productive, and flappable, is a cultural script that leaves little room for vulnerability. Yet, as Mate's work reveals, this suppression comes at a cost. The body, in its wisdom, does not forget the moments when authenticity was sacrificed for approval. A child who learned to please others to feel safe grows into an adult whose stress is a silent scream, a plea to be seen as they are, not as they are expected to be. The nervous system, forever vigilant, hums with the memory of those early lessons, translating them into a restlessness that no amount of achievement can soothe. Stoic philosophy, through Seneca's lens, offers a counterpoint. We are not bound by the opinions of others, only by our response to them. But how does one respond when those opinions are woven into the very air? The woman who feels judged for pausing to rest, the man who senses weakness in his own emotions, they are not just individuals, but vessels for a collective pressure. Society's gaze is relentless, shaping the self through subtle cues, a raised eyebrow, a dismissive tone, a cultural narrative that equates worth with output. These cues become the silent struggles, the invisible weights that accumulate until the body can no longer bear them quietly. Mate's mind-body connection reveals how this stress manifests: headaches that linger, stomachs that knot, hearts that race for reasons the conscious mind cannot grasp. You, sitting there, might feel this in your own way. Perhaps it's the moment you hesitate to speak your truth, fearing it will disrupt the harmony others expect, or the way your body tenses when you scroll through a world that seems to have it all together, while you feel like you're barely holding on. These are not failures but proof of your humanity, of a heart that still longs to be whole. Mate would argue that these moments are invitations, not indictments. The stress that grips you is not a sign of weakness, but a signal that something deeper is asking to be heard. The body, in its quiet wisdom, is begging for reconciliation with the self you've been taught to hide. The Stoics, particularly Epictetus, would urge discernment, to separate what is yours from what is not. The expectations of others, the pressure to perform, they are not your burden to carry. Yet, they feel personal, intimate, as if they were written into your very being. Mate's insight into trauma shows how these external pressures become internal wounds, especially when they echo early experiences of rejection or shame. The child who was told to toughen up becomes the adult who cannot rest without guilt. The girl who was praised for being good becomes the woman who cannot say no without fear. These are the silent struggles, the ones that live in the body's memory, shaping every choice, every breath. This is not a call to despair, but to awareness. To name the weight is to begin to loosen its grip. The body, as Mate teaches, is not an enemy but a guide, whispering truths the mind has forgotten. The silent struggles are not a sentence but a story, one that can be rewritten, to listen to the body, to honor its signals. is to step toward a self that is not defined by the world's demands but by its own quiet strength. The journey is slow, but it begins with a single act of courage. To feel the weight and not look away. The silent struggles carve their paths not in loud declarations but in the quiet corners of the soul, where the body and mind meet in a dance of unspoken truths. Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings illuminate this intersection. Where stress becomes more than a fleeting discomfort, it is the body's protest against a life lived out of alignment with the self. The woman who aches with a knot in her stomach, dreading the day's demands, is not merely tired. Her body is speaking the language of a heart stretched thin by expectation. The man who feels a pang of emptiness in the midst of success is not ungrateful. His soul is signaling a disconnection from what truly matters. These are the body's whispers. Its way of begging for attention in a world that teaches us to ignore its cries. The culture we navigate is the master weaver of these struggles, threading invisible pressures into every interaction. It demands performance be the perfect parent, the tireless worker, the unflappable friend, while offering little space for the messiness of being human. Maté's work on trauma reveals how these demands settle into the body. Not as abstract ideas, but as physical realities. The nervous system, shaped by years of adapting to external expectations, becomes a sentinel, always on guard. A harsh word from a stranger, a fleeting moment of feeling unseen. These are not isolated events, but triggers that awaken old wounds. The body remembers the child who learned to hide their pain to keep the peace, the teenager who swallowed their voice to avoid judgment. Stress, then, is not just a reaction to the present, but a conversation with the past. Marcus Aurelius, in his Stoic reflections, would remind us that the mind can choose its response, that the weight of others' opinions need not define us. Yet, this wisdom feels distant when the world's expectations are etched into the very way we move, breathe, and exist. The woman who apologizes for taking up space, the man who buries his anger to seem in control. They are not weak, but conditioned, shaped by a society that rewards conformity over authenticity. Maté's lens shows how this conditioning becomes stress, how the suppression of the self creates a feedback loop of tension that the body cannot ignore. The headaches, the insomnia, the sudden waves of anxiety, these are not random but purposeful. The body's attempt to reclaim a truth that has been buried. You, watching this, might feel that truth string. Perhaps it's in the way your heart races when you're asked to do more than you can bear, or the exhaustion that lingers even after rest. These are not signs of failure, but of a body that refuses to let you forget who you are. Maté would call this a call to presence. A reminder that healing begins when we listen to the body's signals instead of silencing them. The silent struggles are not just burdens but invitations to pause, to feel, to ask what the heart has been trying to say all along. What would it mean to stop running from that weight, to turn toward it with curiosity instead of shame? The Stoics, through Epictetus, would argue that freedom lies in releasing what we cannot control, the judgments of others, the relentless pace of the world. But Maté's insight adds depth. To release these burdens, we must first understand their roots. Stress is not just a product of today's demands, but of yesterday's wounds, of the moments when we learned to prioritize others' needs over our own. The child who was told to be strong carries that lesson into adulthood, where strength becomes a mask that hides vulnerability. The silent struggles are the cracks in that mask. The moments when the body refuses to play along with the pretense of fine. This refusal, where the journey shifts. To acknowledge the body's signals is to begin dismantling the silent struggles. To see them not as weaknesses, but as signposts toward healing. The woman who feels the weight of being everything to everyone can choose to set it down. Not all at once, but moment by moment. The man who carries the expectation of Stoic silence can learn to speak, even if his voice shakes. Maté's wisdom, paired with Stoic clarity, offers a path to listen to the body, to honor its truth, and to reclaim the self from the invisible pressures that have held it captive. The silent struggles, once seen, become the map to a life lived with intention, not obligation. The silent struggles pulse beneath the surface, a rhythm of unrest that the body carries even when the mind tries to look away. Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings cast light on this rhythm, revealing stress not as a fleeting inconvenience, but as a signal of a deeper fracture, a disconnection from the authentic self, forged in the crucible of societal demands and unhealed wounds. The woman who feels her heart race before a conversation, anticipating judgment, is not simply anxious. Her body is reciting a story of moments when her truth was silenced. The man who aches with a heaviness he cannot explain is not merely tired. His soul is whispering of a life spent chasing external measures of worth. These are the body's truths, etched in tension, in shallow breaths, in the quiet ache that lingers when the world demands more. Society's script is unrelenting, a tapestry of expectations that binds the spirit. Be productive, be pleasant, be unbreakable. These are not just suggestions, but mandates, woven into the fabric of daily life. Maté's work on the mind-body connection shows how these mandates become stress, how they settle into the nervous system like sediment, layering over time. The child who learned to smile through disappointment grows into an adult whose body hums with unease, even in moments of calm. The teenager who hid their fear to fit in becomes the adult whose stress feels like a second skin, inseparable from their being. These are not random aches but echoes, the body's way of remembering what the mind has been taught to forget. Seneca's Stoic wisdom would urge a pause, a moment to question what truly belongs to us, the judgments of others. The pressure to perform they are not ours to carry, yet they feel like chains, forged in the subtle moments of life. A colleague's dismissive glance, a parent's unspoken expectation, a culture that equates rest with weakness. Maté's lens reveals how these moments, especially when rooted in early trauma, shape the body's response to stress. The nervous system, forever alert, interprets every slight as a threat, every demand as a test. The woman who feels she must always be on carries this in her clenched jaw, her racing pulse. The man who suppresses his anger to seem strong feels it in his knotted stomach, his restless nights. The body does not lie, even when the mind tries to dot you. Watching this might feel that lie unraveling. Perhaps it's the moment you say, "I'm okay," when your heart screams otherwise, or the way your body tenses under the weight of unspoken needs. These are not signs of defeat, but of a spirit that refuses to be fully silenced. Maté would call this a call to awareness, a chance to listen to the body's wisdom instead of drowning it out. The silent struggles are not just burdens, but questions. What are you carrying that isn't yours? What truth have you buried to keep the peace? The body, in its quiet rebellion, is asking you to answer, to step toward a self that is not defined by the world's demands but by its own quiet fire. The Stoics, through Marcus Aurelius, would argue that peace lies in aligning with what is within our control, our thoughts, our choices, our responses. But Maté's insight adds a layer: to align with ourselves, we must first unearth the roots of our stress. The silent struggles are often born in moments of disconnection, when we learn to prioritize others' approval over our own truth. The child who was told to be good carries that lesson into adulthood, where goodness becomes a performance that leaves no room for rest. The adult who feels guilty for saying no is not just overwhelmed but tethered to a past where boundaries were a betrayal. These struggles, though silent, are loud in the body, manifesting as tension, fatigue, or a quiet despair that no achievement can soothe. This is the turning point, where awareness becomes power. To listen to the body is to begin dismantling the silent struggles, to see them not as flaws but as invitations to heal. The woman who feels crushed by expectation can choose to pause, to breathe, to ask what her heart needs. The man who hides his pain can choose to speak, even if his voice trembles. Mate's teachings, woven with Stoic clarity, offer a path to honor the body's signals, to release what is not ours, and to reclaim a self that is whole, not fragmented. The silent struggles, once faced, become not chains but stepping stones, guiding the way toward a life of authenticity and peace. The silent struggles hum like a current beneath the skin, a quiet rebellion of the body against a world that demands too much and sees too little. Dr. Gabor Mate's teachings peel back the layers of this rebellion, revealing stress as a language of the soul, a cry for reconnection with a self buried under layers of expectation and unhealed pain. The woman who feels her chest tighten at the thought of disappointing someone is not merely overwhelmed. Her body is recounting a history of moments when her worth was tied to pleasing others. The man who carries a nameless fatigue, even after a day of triumphs, is not ungrateful. His spirit is signaling a life spent chasing shadows of validation. These are the body's truths, written in the language of stress, in the clenched fists and sleepless nights that speak what words cannot. The world does not pause for these truths. It spins forward. A relentless machine of demands: be more, do more, prove more. Society's script is a silent architect, building cages round the heart with its unspoken rules. To rest is to fail. To feel deeply is to be weak. Mate's work on trauma shows how these rules become stress, how they embed themselves in the body's very wiring, the nervous system, shaped by early experiences of conditional love or unspoken shame, becomes a sentinel, always braced for the next judgment, the next expectation. The child who learned to hide their tears to avoid burdening others grows into an adult whose stress is a quiet storm, raging beneath a calm exterior. The body, in its wisdom, refuses to forget, carrying the weight of those early lessons in every tightened muscle, every shallow breath. Epictetus, with his Stoic clarity, would remind us that we are not bound by the world's demands, only by our response to them. But when those demands have shaped the very lens through which we see ourselves, how does one choose differently? The woman who feels invisible unless she's perfect. The man who equates vulnerability with failure. They are not just individuals but archetypes, molded by a culture that rewards performance over presence. Mate's insight into the mind-body connection reveals how this molding becomes stress, how the suppression of the self creates a dissonance that the body cannot ignore, the headaches that linger, the anxiety that flares without warning. These are not random but purposeful. The body's attempt to reclaim a truth that has been buried under layers of should. You, watching this, might feel that truth sting in your own bones. Perhaps it's the way your heart races when you're asked to be more than you can give, or the quiet shame that creeps in when you dare to rest. These are not signs of weakness, but of a body that refuses to let you forget who you are. Mate would call this a sacred invitation, a chance to listen to the body's wisdom instead of silencing it with busyness or denial. The silent struggles are not just weights, but questions. What are you holding that belongs to someone else? What truth have you buried to keep the world's approval? The body, in its quiet defiance, is asking you to answer, to turn toward the stress with compassion instead of fear. The Stoics, through Seneca, would argue that true freedom lies in releasing what we cannot control, the expectations of others, the relentless pace of the world. But Mate's wisdom adds depth. To release these burdens, we must first see their roots. Stress is not just a product of today's pressures, but of yesterday's wounds, of the moments when we learned to shrink ourselves to fit the world's mold. The child who was told to be strong carries that lesson into adulthood, where strength becomes a mask that hides pain. The adult who feels guilty for needing rest is tethered to a past where rest was a luxury, not a right. These silent struggles live in the body, manifesting as tension, as fatigue, as a quiet ache that no external success can heal. This is the moment of transformation, where listening becomes liberation, To hear the body's signals is to begin unraveling the silent struggles. To see them not as chains, but as threads that can be rewoven. The woman who feels crushed by the need to be everything can choose to set that need down, breath by breath. The man who hides his exhaustion can choose to rest, even if it feels like rebellion. Mate's teachings, paired with Stoic resolve, light the way to honor the body's truth, to release what is not ours, and to step toward a self that is whole, not fragmented. The silent struggles, once embraced, become not burdens but guides, pointing toward a life of authenticity and peace. The silent struggles ripple through the body like a tide, pulling at the edges of a self that yearns to be whole. Dr. Gabor Maté's teachings frame this tide as a sacred dialogue, where stress is not an enemy but a messenger, carrying truths the mind has been taught to ignore. The woman who feels a knot in her throat when she's asked to be more than she can give is not merely overwhelmed. Her body is reciting a litany of moments when her needs were pushed aside for the sake of others. The man who carries a quiet anger, masked by a steady voice, is not just tired. His soul is signaling a life spent conforming to a world that equates vulnerability with defeat. These are the body's poems, written in the ink of stress, in the tightened chest and restless mind that refuse to stay silent. The world, with its unyielding rhythm, does not make space for these poems. It demands motion. Keep up, keep smiling, keep proving your worth. Society's gaze is a sculptor, carving the self into shapes that fit its mold. The tireless worker, the selfless caregiver, the unflinching stoic. Mate's work on the mind-body connection reveals how these shapes become stress, how they settle into the body's very cells, the nervous system, wired by years of adapting to external demands, becomes a keeper of secrets, storing every moment when authenticity was traded for acceptance. The child who learned to be good to avoid rejection grows into an adult whose stress is a silent protest, a refusal to let the self be fully erased. The body, in its quiet wisdom, holds these truths, speaking them in aches, in fatigue, in a heart that races for reasons the mind cannot name. Marcus Aurelius would counsel that we are not bound by the world's expectations, only by our choice to carry them. But when those expectations have woven themselves into the fabric of the self, how does one let go? The woman who feels she must always be on, always pleasing, carries this in her shallow breaths, her sleepless nights. The man who buries his pain to seem strong feels it in his clenched jaw, his knotted gut. Mate's lens shows how these burdens, often rooted in early wounds, become stress, how the body becomes a battleground where the self fights to be seen. The silent struggles are not just personal but universal, a shared human experience of navigating a world that rarely asks, "What do you need to feel whole?" You, sitting there, might feel this question stirring. Perhaps it's in the way your body tenses when you're asked to do more than you can bear, or the quiet guilt that creeps in when you dare to pause. These are not failures but signals, the body's way of calling you back to yourself. Mate would call this a moment of grace, an invitation to listen to the body's wisdom instead of drowning it in busyness or shame. The silent struggles are not just weights but doorways. What would it mean to step through them, to ask what your heart has been trying to say all along? The body, in its quiet rebellion, is begging you to listen, to meet its signals with compassion instead of control. The Stoics, through Epictetus, would argue that true peace lies in releasing what is not ours, the judgments of others, the relentless demands of the world. But Mate's insight deepens this. To release these burdens, we must first heal their roots. Stress is not just a reaction to today's pressures, but a conversation with yesterday's pain. With the moments when we learn to shrink ourselves to fit the world's script, the child who was told to be strong carries that lesson into adulthood, where strength becomes a mask that hides vulnerability. The adult who feels guilty for resting is tethered to a past where rest was a privilege, not a right. These silent struggles live in the body, manifesting as tension, as exhaustion, as a quiet despair that no external victory can soothe. This is the cusp of freedom, where awareness becomes transformation. To listen to the body is to unravel the silent struggles, to see them not as chains but as invitations to heal. The woman who feels crushed by expectation can choose to breathe, to set down the need to be everything. The man who hides his pain can choose to speak, even if his voice wavers. Mate's teachings, woven with Stoic resolve, offer a path to honor the body's truth, to release what is not ours, and to embrace a self that is whole, not fragmented. The silent struggles, once faced, become not burdens but beacons, guiding the way toward a life of authenticity and peace. The heart that heals its stress doesn't run, it rests.